In a relatively stunning ruling, a federal appeals court with 3 judges appointed by Donald Trump ruled that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was unconstitutional, not because it lacked the authority to do the things that it was doing, but rather because it was being funded by another agency rather than being funded directly by Congress in an attempt to protect it from external control. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am a professor of political science here at Campbellsville University, as well as the director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute of Public Policy. And we're here today to talk about this idea of regulatory agency or regulatory control, how Congress has established regulation, whether or not Congress has delegated too much authority, a whole range of very exciting and interesting topics about how our lives are run. I'm joined today by 2 of our senior seminar panelists as they appear on my screen. First of all, Zachary Budd. Zach, thank you for joining us today. And also being joined by the one, the only Luke Glasscock. Mr. Glasscock, thank you for being here. How are y'all today, gentlemen?
Good. How about you?
Good.
Doing fantastic. So let's just kind of jump into the middle of this. For a lot of our viewers, they may not necessarily understand the difference between a regulatory agency or some other type of agency. To kind of help them out, what exactly is regulatory authority, and where does it come from?
Billy, do you want this one or you want me to get it?
Oh, you looked like you were going to talk, but I can take it. I don't care. It's up to you.
Okay. You got it.
All right. So regulatory agencies, they're like, there's like several common ones, such as like that most people have heard of, like the EPA, the Department of Education, like all these things. And they're part of the executive branch, and like most of them are headed by like the president's cabinet members. And so they make decisions. They're sort of like a focus on a certain policy area, I guess you would say. And so they make decisions about these things, and their power is like vested in them from Congress. They sort of have like oversight over these committees, but basically they have like a lot of latitude in making decisions and enforcing. And that's really the ultimate thing. They're like enforcers of policy. So Congress might give them a directive about environmental policy or education policy, and they sort of have like latitude in deciding what exactly they specifically can do with that and how they can affect change in the United States.
So, Zach, help me understand this then. Why doesn't Congress just pass the rules regulating stuff on their own? Why do they create these regulatory agencies to do it?
So I think the benefit of having the regulatory agencies are to have specialized departments for certain policies, certain rules that need to happen that Congress just simply doesn't have the expertise nor the time to be able to study or have for. So the importance of the regulatory agencies through Congress is just so you can have that extra department of your own, not your own, but of the government that helps create keeps the safety and the well-being of the United States citizens without having to have Congress who may or may not have anything to do with anything that's going on, like that just don't know anything about the subject or what's going on with it.
Are you suggesting that Congress isn't necessarily an expert on all highly specialized things?
No, not at all. You could definitely go up to anybody in Congress and ask them about what kind of chemicals need to be in our food, and they probably have no idea. They just give it out to the FDA and just say go for it.
Are there ever any situations where it might be in the best interests of the private sector, where businesses would actually go to Congress and say, hey, we need you to regulate us, or we need you to create a regulatory authority for us? Or is this simply about Congress trying to find ways to use its power more effectively?
I didn't do research on that per se. Perhaps if they're having issues as far as like the industry as a whole, like a certain company or certain corporations, like, okay, to like increase like the trust in our business as a whole, like other companies may be violating like environmental issues or whatever, it might be beneficial if just like protect everyone else from each other to have a regulator like make sure everyone's following the same amount of rules. So it's not just Congress grabbing power, I wouldn't say, or it's not just the executive branch grabbing power. It's often very important, and it's often more efficient for them to be able to just put rules out for everyone to follow. And I think a lot of it does revolve around corporations having to comply to certain standards.
I was thinking too that with I did a little bit of my my essay on the ability of, or the difference between if the regulatory agencies went to private sector versus staying in the public sector with the with legislation. And I think I found that there was some evidence kind of supporting both, whether if the regulatory agencies went to the private sector versus the versus staying under legislative control. And there were, it was kind of hard trying to figure out if I needed to prove my hypothesis or disprove it, because there were both evidence supporting, benefits to both, rather than having, the regulatory agencies stay under congressional control or go to the private sector, being, financially supported, being able to just figure out what they needed to do. So it is kind of interesting trying to figure out whether it would be beneficial or not if they went to the private sector versus, staying under more legislative control. Because there's a lot of disparity of it between, in the political science world.
Yeah, coming back to a point that you made earlier, Luke, and I may have my companies wrong, but I think that the origins of the Food and Drug Administration actually started with Heinz Corporation, because Heinz was one of the first companies to start packaging in clear glass bottles as a way of demonstrating the purity of their food or the wholesomeness of their food. And they were very much interested in making sure that if a company was going to claim that they had pure food or clean food or food at the same standard that their products were, that there was some kind of agency verifying the truth of the advertising or the truth in their claim. So I could certainly see, to the point that you're making, I could certainly see how that might make sense. And I guess to the argument that you were just making, Zach, do you think that we as citizens benefit from having these regulatory agencies? Like, on balance, are we better off having the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or are we on balance better off having something like the Environmental Protection Agency, or do they just make our lives more complicated?
I think they're a little bit more complicated because you have all these different agencies instead of having to rely just on Congress for specific rules and actions, besides, Congress being the ones that pass the laws. But I think it's greatly beneficial that we have all these different agencies, because we have this collection of scientists, and to help lead to figure out, how much CO2 that these businesses need to be emitting, how much chemicals go in our food to keep us healthy without, causing different kinds of reactions or diseases that may happen. I think it's pretty beneficial that we have all these different kinds of agencies, even though it can be a little confusing, and it can be, cumbersome to try to figure out, at least in the congressional stage, whether, who's, controlling who's trying to get what passed, etc. I think it's pretty beneficial that we have them.
I would say that, a lot of people probably see a lot of these agencies as sort of just like red taping everything. I would say corporations probably feel this more than just regular citizens. I don't think a lot of people think about many of the agencies. But an example I used was during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Imagine so we had different departments. You had Health and Human Services, which is actually a cabinet level agency. And then you had also advisory level things from like the CDC. And so, they were outsourced, the executive branch was outsourcing like their, who's like making rules, who's making recommendations and whatnot. And I just like imagine if you had a Congress that was trying to make mask mandates or any of these things that people saw as beneficial or helpful. If they were in charge of it, where would we actually be? And I don't have an answer to that, but you can imagine just how more politically divisive the situation would have became. And where would we be with vaccines? And there's other examples like throughout history of like how would our government have responded. And so it's probably just a lot easier, even though it can be confusing. It's a really big topic. I mean, there's so many different agencies, and there's lots of things that they do and lots of rules that they create every single year. And so it is very confusing. It's very big, and it's hard to look at it as a whole of like how beneficial it is. But ultimately, there are good examples of things that, if you think about how it would have actually gone down if it had to go through a vote in Congress, what would the negative outcome be? And I would say it probably would have not ended as well as it has thus far.
I think there's actually an argument. Is it Sass from Nebraska, who just recently accepted a post as president of the University of Florida system? One of his frequent complaints was that what often would happen was, rather than Congress taking a position and doing its job because it would be politically expedient, it was punting decisions to regulatory agencies. If Congress had to take a decision, politics would get involved, and they didn't want to be held politically accountable. So they would just let these regulatory agencies be responsible. But if that's true, that hinges on the assumption that Congress is actually in control of these agencies. Do you feel that that's accurate? Do you think that Congress is effectively controlling these groups, or are they somehow being controlled by other entities?
Can I take this one?
Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah. So there's, I'm under the assumption that Congress does have control over these agencies. So for each of the agencies, there's a committee that is within the agencies, and within those committees, there's a subcommittee, of course, that is conducted of the experts in the field and the legislators, and then all the committees are headed by a chairman, which the chairman or chairwoman pretty much controls everything about the committee, and it's not more like it's not more like how a Supreme Court would be, where you have the head justice, and then everyone else kind of falls around, and the head justice leads. It's not like that. It's pretty much just very much like a control substance for that chairman or chairwoman. So they lead that, which heads everything in the Congress. And then actually too, Congress has two kind of ways that they control different authorities, regulatory authorities. There's two ways. There's oversight, and there's statutory control provisions. So with oversight, they take direct control of specific agencies that they need to monitor, and then they figure out whether they need to reward, remedy, or penalize behavior that goes against or with whatever whoever is controlling that agency with the specific committee. So if they present a law that they want to get passed that's different than if they present a law that wants to get passed, it's different than what the chairman or chairwoman have decided how they want to go with the field. They could penalize them or try to change their behavior. There's also a statutory control, which is different than oversight control, though, because they try to build the structure to favor favor some policies over than others from the ground up. So they don't have to worry about things trying to get passed or things being presented without their oversight, without their permission. Sorry, I was brain farting for a second on that word.
Complicated vocabulary. What about you, Luke? Do you feel like regulatory agencies are effectively being controlled by Congress? I mean, Zach listed several different kind of broad tools. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's actually working, or do you feel like these agencies are being captured by other forces?
Well, I would say it works. Again, he did mention the two sort of methods that they can control. And I did, as in some of my research, I read that in like the statutory provisions or whatever, they generally give them sort of like broad stroke, like directives, I guess. And so, they can sort of take it and run if they want to. But also you have to look at the influence that the president has over, these agencies. Obviously he gets to appoint cabinet positions who become the heads of these agencies. Like a good example is like in the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland. Just something we see often in the news. And so sort of the goals of the president become the goals of that agency. There's some influence from the top down on that as well, as far as what laws they want to enforce, things that they hold important and dear to them. And so, there is that as well, beyond just legislative influence.
Yeah, I can certainly see that being true. I remember with the Trump administration, and he wasn't the first person to have done this, but the Trump administration, he appointed Betsy DeVos as Secretary of the Department of Education, who was a person who believed that the Department of Education should not exist. Rick Perry was made the Secretary of Energy, and he believed that the Department of Energy should not exist. It's kind of difficult to think of how a regulatory agency will effectively regulate an industry when the person in charge of the agency believes that no such regulation should exist in the first place. Like I would think that Congress would kind of lose control of that situation in a hurry. Yeah. Do you feel like these agencies have effective or sufficient power to do their job from Congress through statutory allocation? Or do you feel that many of them are kind of hamstrung or left insufficient and not up to the task?
There was part also of my study that I did where I think that they have the tools and the personnel that they have the tools and the personnel to be able to execute what they want to do and what they are told to do. But there are also a lot of issues presented with congressional deadlines and presidential deadlines that they have to face. So there was one study that I found in my research that looked over how agencies actually have an issue. They would be able to benefit greatly from doing economic research and analysis for their specific department, but they don't get the time that they need to do that research because of congressional deadlines and presidential deadlines. So it's really hard for them to be able to execute their accurate and precise data, which they have the capabilities to do because of the people that they that work for them. They're all very specialized in their field of study, but they have the power to execute what they need to do. Just sometimes it may be difficult because they're not given the resources nor the time to be able to execute it well.
Yeah, this is actually one of the recent controversies where the Democrats made the argument that part of the problem with the IRS is they just simply didn't have sufficient resources to go after wealthy individuals that weren't paying their taxes, that the number of tax loopholes or ways of trying to hide illegally tax gains had gotten to the point where without additional manpower, the IRS just couldn't catch people. And of course, conservatives were appalled at the notion of more IRS agents, but I guess the Democrats won the day on that. Mr. Glasscock, what do you think? Do you think these agencies have sufficient authority?
I would say they probably have sufficient authority. I've read studies on sort of their efficiency, and I think that is a sort of an area where they may run into problems. And he mentioned sort of some of the roadblocks in their way to, deadlines and whatnot. But as far as efficiency, they're not always necessarily efficient in comparison to, they get things done, but in comparison to like sort of the, I guess, like net benefit, as far as money they spend versus like the positive outcome, a lot of times like it's fairly inefficient in that sense. And so they may have plenty of authority to do so. But just like, I think, again, resources and having enough people to just make sure everything is going smoothly and things like that, or maybe, be like problematic on that front. And so, sort of like a toss-up question. It's kind of difficult to answer, but
So to make sure I understand that your point you're making, you were talking about the amount of money they spend versus the benefit. So if an agency were to have like $100 million of economic benefit, but its budget was $50 million, that may not, is that the kind of efficiency that you're talking about, or are you thinking about efficiency differently?
Yeah, an economic benefit. I think I read a study. I don't remember if they looked at all of them as a whole, if it was one specific one, and so the economic cost was like $200 billion, and the economic benefit as a whole was $250 billion. So there's only a net positive of 50 billion or whatever number it was, and in reality, that's not that great in comparison to the amount of money and resources they have to use to achieve a fairly small margin of like. It's not profit, but I guess you could call it like, sort of.
Right. The return on investment for the federal government, that $200 billion might have been better served somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And coming back to the research that you had done, Zach, do you feel like much of this regulation could be better done if it was simply left up to the private sector to self-regulate? Or do you think that the private sector just can't be trusted with these kinds of problems?
So I think that, my original hypothesis was that if you left it to the private sector, that it wouldn't be very well trusted because people wouldn't want to have the funds necessary to be able to do it. But I think with the study that the research that I did, that it would actually I think it would harm more people if it would be more beneficial for it to go to the private sector, because they wouldn't have like I mentioned earlier, they wouldn't have the specific deadlines that they have to meet or the presidential, influence that they have in order to be able to get their work done. They would have the time, and I still think the monetary issue would be there with, maybe not necessarily having all the funding that they would need, but I do believe that they would be able to, like what Luke said, be able to make a net change, a positive change with the amount of money that they get versus the amount of studies that they do, the results that they publish, and the changes that they present to Congress. I think it would be more beneficial to have it go to the private sector versus staying in congressional or staying in public sector with that stuff.
I would say, as far as it could be more efficient in the sense that the people, if you send it back to the private sector, and these people probably are more involved in the specific area that they're going to be regulating, I guess. But I would see a potential issue with this is, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, which does like antitrust laws and whatnot, has the backing of the Department of Justice for its prosecuting power. And so you run into this question, who's backing sort of this private sector? Ultimately, these are executors of the law. They execute and they enforce these laws. And that's ultimately the importance of these agencies of government. So if you send it to the private sector, how well, it may be more efficient understanding what the issues are, how to fix these issues, but how well can you actually enforce the solutions to any of these issues is sort of the big question there.
Do you think that there are some industries that it would be easier for the industry to self-regulate than others? Are there some aspects or some parts of the economy that we just simply can't trust the businesses to look out for consumers' best interests?
Probably, I would say the food one is a very good example of a thing that probably would self-regulate very well because you sort of have this competition, and so if one major food company knows that hey, there's issues over here, they can use that as a competitive advantage. Probably something that would not regulate very well or would be very concerning is probably manufacturing industries, oil company, or not just oil companies, but fossil fuel industry. And not that there's anything wrong with those. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that ultimately they're probably going to be sort of a group of, corporations that are like not going to worry about each other and try and make it competitive. Like, hey, we're doing this better than these are. It doesn't matter if they're all winning, it's fine. They're not going to try because ultimately if they want another company to be clean and regulate, that means they also have to spend the money and do the same things. And so I just don't see that companies like that would probably regulate very well from private sector enforcement.
I also don't believe that there are too many, agencies or sectors of, of anything that will regulate well without, intervention. I think piggybacking off of Luke said with the food and drug, the FDA, also on that, I think that there would be a lot of drug manufacturers as well who maybe try to get the least amount of bang for the most amount of buck. Try to reverse that, and that would prevent certain types of medicine that people need. People have to buy more because the containments of what is in the medicine are maybe lower. I also think that any of the health institutions would be very would be trying to flip everything around to where it's more of a positive economic game rather than trying to have basic guidelines for making sure people will get help. That's not saying that the people that are working there want to focus more on the money, like nurses or doctors, want to focus more on the money, but I don't believe that they could strip away the guidelines and the basic principles that they have to have in order to make sure that people are getting their health care, the same. And I think that along the fact, I think that labor as an issue too will come up in a lot of different places if everything was left to the private sector. Is that people will try to take more advantage of the labor that they have and either pay them less or not, or make them overworked. Whereas that now there's basic fundamental labor laws that you have to have for each department and division, that if it was out of legislative control, it could be completely different on different kinds of things. So I don't think that that would be I don't think anything would be really good without having some sort of governmental control behind it.
I'm going to add something there. Actually, I think Zach brought up a really good topic to look at this, sir, and I really didn't think about it. But as far as drugs are concerned, and if you look at Social Security benefits, the government actually gives doctors and whatnot medicine, or not, it doesn't give them medicine, but medicines that they will cover and not cover. And I think that is a real life example of something that people find very frustrating. And so actually, this would be a good example if perhaps it was privately regulated, although you have the concerns over cost, that people actually may receive a benefit as far as the medicine options that they have and quality of medicine that they can, especially older people. But again, you have the issue of, opiate producers, and, there's class action lawsuits and whatnot from people that became addicted to, were prescribed basic medicines that were seen as just low-level painkillers and became addicted to other drugs once that stopped. And so, where would we be if government wasn't regulating things like that? Would they still be prescribing these things? Because drug companies, cheap to make, and people would become addicted to it. They were, it was a profit sort of mongering thing that, they took advantage of. And, Eastern Kentucky is a place that was drastically affected by this. And so again, it's this issue of looking at sort of the costs and the benefits of going either way. So you may receive advantages one way, but then companies are trying to, obviously, their goal is profit. And so, it's a very layered and complex issue, I would say.
Yeah, it is complex, but I think y'all are doing a pretty good job of laying out for our viewers some of the differences. And so, for example, you mentioned food quality. I think if a manufacturing facility that's responsible for packaging chicken doesn't have food safety standards, we figure out pretty quickly people are going to start getting sick. We start to identify that certain stores, certain manufacturing locations are responsible for putting bad chicken on the market. Kroger is going to say, you're making our customers sick. We're not going to continue to sell your product anymore. That might do it. You have a lot of sick people, but relatively quickly. But with something like with pharmaceuticals, I mean, if I'm taking a blood pressure medication, how do I know, other than the fact that I don't have a heart attack in 3 years, how do I know if the medication that I'm taking right now has any positive benefits? I mean, until I have the heart attack, and again, it may take 3 or 4 years before the medication I find out isn't working. There's really no way to know whether or not the drugs we're taking are actually doing what they purport they're going to do until months, years later, in a massive aggregate. It's just less information available to the consumer, and therefore, I guess, harder to regulate. So, no, I think that's a pretty good job. Do you feel like that we could move from a scenario where Congress creates these regulatory agencies to where the president is just simply responsible for themselves? Do you think that we would be better served if the states were responsible for individually regulating something like air quality or drug quality? Or do you think that the current way of doing it, where Congress takes the lead, Congress has regulatory authority, do you think that's the correct model?
I think kind of staying with Congress would, be more beneficial. I was thinking about when you were asking that question is versus, if it was president, I wasn't really thinking of, states versus country or anything. I was more thinking about, president versus legislator. And I think if the president had, I was thinking if the president had the, sole control over these agencies, I think about it as the perspective of everything of one person versus the perspective of 500, 600, if you include the House plus the Senate, on issues like that. I guess it's just a House. It would probably just be 400 people. Whereas with the Congress, you can have they can debate about these issues and get laws changed around where you have multiple different aspects of people from all around the country that aren't necessarily just all rich white people or all part of a conglomerate that's the same kind of people. You have different kinds of people that have come from different backgrounds, are different parts of the country where maybe if you're up in North Dakota, it's probably clean air. It's probably as best as you can get with all the natural parks that are over there and just different kinds of administrations. But you might have someone from LA who probably doesn't have the best air quality, and they have a different aspect of they have a different perspective of what the air quality should look like versus somewhere else. So I think that it would be beneficial to keep it in the legislative control, so you have more of an influence of people from around the country rather than just one person as the presidential control. And that's how I was kind of thinking about it. I think it would just allow for more perspective of that kind of influence rather than just one person trying to decide everything that was going on.
That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought of it as far as using our federalist system and going to states. And I think you sort of look at these issues again. It's so complex. It's really hard to look at it as a whole and say. But I think you can look at things at different agencies and kind of gauge how fine-tuned they would actually get to a certain area. For example, like the Food and Drug Administration. That's like a nationwide thing. Like, there's no different standard that there should be for different areas. Like, it's not geographical. It's not any of these things. And so, but if you're looking at air quality or water quality or different things like that, I would say each state, each city, each, urban area has different issues that may not be as efficient for the federal government to just say, all right, this is the whole plan, when in reality, if the state could look at it from a localized perspective and could realize, all right, this is what we actually need to do, it may actually work more efficiently. And so to increase that, I would say perhaps go to the states for some things. But again, it would require, considering that the states each have different political or partisan makeup, it would require still that they're receiving directives from, the federal government, like, okay, we need to improve water quality, but we're going to let you decide how to do it. Like, you can't just say, okay, you get to do whatever. You're still going to have sort of at least a baseline, like, all right, this is the standard. You can figure out, we'll let you regulate it. We'll let you figure out how to do it, but you can't just not do it. That's like sort of the big thing, I guess, what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I guess coming back to the question you guys addressed earlier about would businesses ever want to have such regulation? If you are a food manufacturer or any other industry, and you're trying to sell your product from Kentucky across multiple state lines, I could certainly see where having 8 different regulatory authorities being responsible for regulating the quality of your product would make it difficult for you to create a product that you could then sell nationwide, as opposed to having one regulatory authority setting some kind of a minimum standard. And as long as that was high enough, then the states would hopefully leave it alone and allow industries to be able to work together. Well, we are just about out of time. I wanted to thank both of my guests for joining me today. Regulatory agencies are certainly not one of the hottest topics on people's minds, and yet, quite frequently, it's something that comes up in politics. So thank you guys very much for participating. And for those of you who are at home, don't forget to join us next week, as we're going to be talking about critical infrastructure. Again, one of those topics that comes up almost every single time we have a presidential election, and whether or not we should be investing in our economy or allowing private sector to do itself. We will have the next session on November the 17th. We will then be taking off for Thanksgiving, and we will have one final KIP discussion before the end of the semester. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. Goodbye and God bless.